Okay, folks, we're going to get started soon. This live stream is going to be about Vivek Ramaswamy's. I had this whole live stream planned for anti-Semitism because I do think that what Israel is doing in Gaza right now is going to spark a lot more anti-Semitism around the world. In fact, we're starting to see that here in Canada and in the United States. Anti-Semitism is already, I think, the highest. I think it is the group that experiences the most hate in Canada. Canada has the fourth largest Jewish community in the world, and anti-Semitism has consistently, I believe, risen over the past few decades. So I was gonna do this whole live stream on that, and then I watched almost half of Vivek Ramaswamy's current interview with Piers Morgan on the Israel-Hamas war, and I just thought I couldn't miss up this opportunity because Vivek really shed light on what I think are some weaknesses that I see in a lot of leaders when it comes to the Israel-Hamas war, which is, in my opinion, a clear lack of academic study about the war, the conflict itself, the history, the underpinnings. The talking points are so easy to see through, and I think Vivek really showed me something in this interview because my initial opinion about Vivek had been, here's this young presidential candidate, my age, brown man. Maybe there's like a complex there. I'm like, wow, I see a brown man who's my age running for U.S. president. That's amazing. And some of his ideas, I thought, okay, like I kind of see that. But then he has other ideas, and I totally disagree with him on. And when it comes to the Israel-Hamas war, I initially thought he would be very thoughtful in his approach, very reflective of the academic understanding of the history of the conflict, showcasing at least some knowledge of what has happened. And in this interview with Piers, I think he's just really doubled down on what we've heard before from other leaders. So I'm going to just stop there, and we're going to cut to a piece of that interview right now.
Be precise about
this,
because as I was waiting to interview you, I was looking at your tweets today, actually, about Israel. And it just seemed to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed to me you'd suddenly decided to take a much more direct and tough position. And you said this: now is the moment for Israel to return to its founding premise. The Jewish state has an absolute right to exist, a divine gift, gifted to a divine nation, charged with a divine purpose. Israel has an absolute, unequivocal right and responsibility to defend itself to the fullest, applying the only language its adversaries understand, the language of force. And what would David Ben-Gurion say? Don't depend on anyone else's fleeting sympathies or permission to do it. If Israel wants to destroy Hamas, Israel should go ahead and destroy Hamas. If Israel wants to destroy Hezbollah, Israel should go ahead and destroy Hezbollah. If Israel and Mossad want to pull off Munich 2.0 and take out every last leader of Hamas, whether they're hiding from Doha to Dresden, and host a red wedding at the Four Seasons in Qatar, they should go ahead and do it. Now, when I read that, I was a bit taken aback because your rhetoric about Israel, I would say before all this, back in the summer, was not as strident as this.
Well, this is in the wake of an attack. What I'm saying is the principle is the same. The U.S. should not be involved. But when the U.S. is not involved, I think that's better for the U.S. It's also better for Israel to be able to pursue its own national self-interest.
Here's the question I'm going to ask you. It sounds to me like your support for Israel is they can do what the hell they like.
Yes.
But you want to be president of the United States. Mm-hmm. And there are many people in America, you know this, who are extremely concerned about the proportionate scale of the Israeli response already. And it's only likely to get a lot worse before anything is resolved here. Is your support for them unconditional? Because it sounds like it is.
My support for their right to national self-existence and self-defense and carrying out whatever the heck they think is appropriate in response to the attack submitted on them, Yes, it is not our job to get involved in this in one direction or another.
But it is the American president's job, actually, to get involved in all these things, because America...
I don't think so, actually, and that's where I differ from people in both camps.
Let me rephrase it. Historically, it's been...
So that right there, this idea that it's not, it's not in the American, it's not the president, it's not in the interest of the United States president to get involved. I think that's a very one-dimensional viewpoint of looking at international affairs. I mean, what's happening right now in Israel and Hamas in the Middle East can really destabilize that region. Saudi Arabia was very close to inking, I believe it was a treaty between Saudi Arabia and the Israeli government weeks before October 7th, and now Saudi Arabia is calling for an immediate ceasefire because they are very much worried about what's happening in Gaza. And to think that this doesn't have ramifications globally, and to think that the United States president could simply say, well, it's none of our concern because we're not the global police. I get that argument to a certain extent because the United States has been involved in endless wars. I totally get that. But in a conflict like this, we look to leaders to condemn any type of war crime on either side. The targeting of civilians, the killing of children and women, those are actual war crimes decided by the international community. So we look to international leaders to uphold those international standards. So Vivek's response is very one-dimensional and it's not substantive, but I'll keep it going, and I want to know what your thoughts are. So let me know in the chat too.
His position in the world, to be leader of the free world, to be almost the world's global policeman. And it sounds to me, if you were to become president, what you're saying is any country can, in interests of its own self-defense, can do what the hell it likes, and you won't condemn it. Is there no limit to that?
Well, look, I think that within the bounds of following international law, right, within the bounds of the legal framework that we all abide by, yes, it's not our job to be the global policeman. And I think there's a lot to what you said there, Piers, that's true. Historically, especially if you look at the last 25, 30, 40 years, that has been the role of the United States, is to try to play this role of global cop. Well, I'm running for president of the United States of America, and my job as the U.S. president is to look after American interests. That's a shift from the neoconservative view. It's a shift from the model of...
Okay, again, just doubling down on that whole, idea that this is the American-only view. It totally does away with the idea of the international community as a whole. Now, I will say that on some level, nationalism can be viewed as racist, on some level, right? Any type of nationalism can be viewed by someone as racist, as not inclusive. And I get that to an extent, right? In order for someone to feel this sense of nationalist pride, in a way, it's kind of saying us first, them second. And that makes sense, again, to some degree. But on issues where there's a war happening, where it's clear that there are international war crimes that are happening, again, the expectation of leaders who have been adamant and advocates of the international communities and have been the co-creators of the international organizations that exist today, regardless of your stance on whether or not the efficacy of the United Nations, NATO, and other ICJ, international criminal courts, are actually effective, to me, the biggest blunder is actually saying that, well, it's America first from now on. Well, hang on. There's a history there of your country contributing to the creation of the international order. So regardless of your own personal opinion, which Vivek's clear personal opinion is America should not get involved in all these different things, in my opinion, it's you have to marry your opinion with your role as the U.S. president to uphold international institutions while still being able to criticize them. As critical as Donald Trump was of NATO and the fact that many countries were not putting forward 2% of their GDP, he still upheld his responsibilities as a NATO ally. In fact, he demanded more out of NATO allies to uphold their responsibilities. So you could almost make the argument that Donald Trump was perhaps the biggest proponent, perhaps, of NATO, because he saw what it could be if everybody contributed what they did. So I don't know, sometimes it might be, we might be getting lost in the rhetoric here, but I do think that there is a duty, regardless of what party you are and your personal opinion. If you are to become president of the United States, I do feel there's a duty for you to uphold international law and international organizations, because what's happening in the Middle East will well, not to the extent, but international issues will happen during your 4 or 8 year term. And countries around the world look to the United States to take leadership on international issues. I'm going to keep playing this. There's some more nuggets to this interview that I found really fascinating. So let me just switch over to that.
This is because I come from a different generation that has seen the costs of $6.5 trillion of our national debt attributable to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that did not advance U.S. interests.
Okay.
Thousands upon thousands.
I'm
of
just going to
innocent
forward this
lives
because he does a lot of
sacrificed.
talking, like political points here. But I have to give it to Piers. Piers really does hold him to account here. And, you know, I have my own opinions about Piers Morgan, but I will say that in this interview, Piers really did, like, hold Vivek's feet to the fire, put Vivek's feet to the fire, if that's the saying.
What happens now in this war? Because if things were to escalate, and just before I sat down with you, I saw a statement from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, extremely censorious, demanding an immediate ceasefire, saying that they think this could be a disaster for the region. You've got President Erdogan of Turkey calling Israel overtly war criminals now in a rally in Turkey. This is really escalating fast.
So I think we need to de-escalate it. And I don't think our military presence there helps that.
I'm going to come to how that may or may not transpire. But the idea that this is not relevant or pertinent to America's national interest is for the birds, isn't it?
Well, I'm not saying that it's not relevant or pertinent what's happening in the world. My question is, does our military engagement help our national interests? And that's a different question.
What about the number of little attacks we're seeing on American troops all around
Exactly
the region?
Proves my point. Why do we have troops in Syria? Why do we have troops in Iraq? We were told, the American public, yes, most people before this began in the last 2 weeks, they would tell you we don't even have a presence in Syria and Iraq. That's what we've been led to believe. So we have sitting targets, and now we're going to create more sitting targets. What are those sitting targets when they're hit? They're accidental tripwires. That's how major conflicts result when nobody on either side of that conflict has an interest in getting into it. So I worry when you have a loose network of even loosely affiliated renegade band groups, Islamic terrorist groups that are not even centrally managed in any way. You cross a tripwire, and my rule of thumb for the U.S., as a commander-in-chief, I'll say it now, I'll say it again. If you hit us, we will hit you back 10 times harder. That's just a rule I'll stick to. But if they're hitting us on bases that we shouldn't have been in the first place, we're creating the opportunities for escalation into larger scale regional war that doesn't advance our interests. So I would bring them home from Syria and Iraq.
But America has kept troops at a lot of bases around that region.
I'd get them out.
Really?
Yes.
Because the whole purpose of
this is where I really don't understand Vivek's thought process. You know, the idea of bringing home troops from around the world, again, in theory, it makes sense, right? You take troops from, other bases around the world and you say, okay, they're coming home. Again, this is an extension of what Trump said in 2016. And I think it was met with some agreement from many who have a very strong nationalist view. And to be honest, not only people with strong nationalist views, this has been an argument from the left throughout the 90s and early 2000s against this idea of neocolonialism. Neocolonialism was the United States having these military bases stationed all around the world to promote American interests, aka don't elect someone who's anti-American or we'll figure out a way to rig the ballot so that we get a pro-American in there. I say that with a smirk, but I don't mean that to take that lightly, because there were many elections that, the United States, I'm assuming, had a really big hand in, and people did lose their lives defending what they thought was freedom. And so I think, again, this idea that removing military from bases around the world is met with fanfare from some on the left and the right. But the timing of Vivek to say that, especially right now where we're looking to presidents and world leaders to actually do something about what's happening, because the images and the videos coming out of Gaza right now are spurring mass protests all across the world. And Vivek's responses have just been they've just fallen flat. And I'm just going to continue playing it here. Give me a sec.
Try and maintain some sort of order amid a lot of potential chaos.
And I think it's been unsuccessful. I mean, even if you look at right now, the fact that we have that presence, I'm going to stick specifically to Syria and Iraq, let's be precise. I don't think that serves any strategic purpose. To the contrary, it creates sitting duck targets in moments like these that unnecessarily create tripwires for major regional conflict in the Middle East. And so nobody has given me a good answer, and I don't think nobody's given the American people a good answer on why the heck we are still in Syria and Iraq. We shouldn't be. There's no...
Okay, so I think that, and again, I see where Vivek is coming from. It's true, we don't really have a good reason for why the United States is in as many countries as it is. I can't remember the total count, but they're definitely in over 100. There's over 100 military bases. Let me find that out. There's like a lot of bases around the world. How many U.S. bases in the world? I feel like there's a lot. Okay, it says over 1,000. 750 U.S. bases in some 80 countries and colonies around the world. More bases than any nation, empire, or people in world history. Very interesting. Again, it makes sense, right? I mean, that we know of, right? But over 80 countries, we're in over 80 countries. So to Vivek's point, I mean, by that logic, why is the United States in many countries? We don't know. There are other than strategic interests at play. So there are strategic interests that Vivek should be aware of. Why the United States is in Iraq and Syria and other countries. Yeah, again, it falls on deaf ears in times like now when there's a massive war happening.
Strategic interested issue there. It's strictly downside risk, especially in times of emotional response like this. It's a bad idea all the way down. So I stand by that principle. Now, I'm not some sort of pacifist isolationist for the sake of being an ideologue about it. No, I look at every individual region of the world, every theater, through the lens of American self-interest. And I worry, Piers, the ultimate winner in this is actually going to be China. Watching us, if we are mired in another large-scale, regional, prolonged, no-win war in the Middle East, China's the beneficiary of that. And you look at the amount of munitions we've given to Ukraine, about 101.5 million rounds of artillery.
The argument of that China is going to be the beneficiary, again, it's not addressing what Americans and many around the world are looking to for their leaders, which again is some type of response to what's happening in the Middle East right now. And people don't seem to think or care about who's the beneficiary of this, when the dust settles, etc. People care about their immediate needs, and right now that doesn't tie back to people's immediate needs. So I'm so surprised that he would even mention that.
The people here are taking in the United States.
I'm just going to forward it a bit because there's some again interesting questions from Piers for holding to the fire.
Voted a motion for ceasefire in this war. The United States voted against that motion. The United Kingdom, my country, abstained. Where do you sit on that?
I think the United Nations has outlived its purpose.
So right there, he's ducking the question of ceasefire, and he never answers it. Instead, he just goes on this rant about the United Nations and international organizations being basically useless.
I really think that the statements that Secretary General Guterres made, I think on Wednesday this week, were offensive. They were senseless in nature, trying to draw a false equivalence between Israel's behaviors versus the Hamas attacks on Israel. That false equivalence is everything you might, if I see it from a 19-year-old freshman at Harvard College, I call the kid lost and hungry in search of purpose and meaning. But to see this from the Secretary General of the UN, that's toxic. I personally think that we should have an open conversation about the U.S.'s continued involvement in the UN. I don't think that should be a foregone conclusion.
Really?
If you think about a body whose Human Rights Council is staffed by the rights of Venezuela.
This is where I totally lose him. I'm just like, why are we now talking about the relevancy of the United Nations. The United Nations, again, regardless of what we think about the efficacy of the United Nations, and I agree, I don't know if the United Nations is actually effective at its vision and mission, but that's besides the point. When we think about UN Security Council resolutions, when we think of UN resolutions, we think that, again, as an outsider, we think that countries are coming together on a major international issue and are trying to drum up some type of baseline acceptance of fact. And here, the United Nations put forward a resolution for a ceasefire. And Piers is asking Vivek point blankly what his thoughts are, and he's completely dodging the question. So it goes to show to me that Vivek, as much as he says he's America first and he doesn't want to get involved, he may actually not want a ceasefire as well. He actually may not want this war to end, and that's pretty scary.
Korea, it's a farce. It doesn't serve an actual coherent purpose. And so this is just Guterres' statements in the last week are just another
what he
symptom
said
of an institution that's outlived its purpose.
He said it's important to recognize Hamas's attacks didn't happen in a vacuum, and Palestinians have been subjected to 5 decades of suffocating occupation. Now, I agree with the criticism that it was very badly worded, because he was trying to imply that somehow the Israelis...
I mean, the timing of that versus him saying that 6 months ago is different.
You see, it just keeps going on about this criticism of the UN, and he's not answering the question of ceasefire, and that is really, that tells me a lot. I'm just going to...
Have just cause, historically, over the land issues and everything else. But this attack on October the 7th was a completely different scale of attack. And I don't think you should look at anything else but that in terms of what is Israel's response. And the question for me, having said that, and I think you would agree with that, is what is proportionate here?
So I want to be very clear about where I stand on this as someone running for U.S. president. I'm not running for president of the UN, Secretary General of the UN, whatever it is. I'm not running for president of Israel. I'm running for president of the United States of America.
You see, right there, that framing is just so belittling to the question and to the acknowledgement of the history of the conflict in the Middle East. It shows to me that Vivek just really does not know at all what is happening in the Middle East. The history, the context, the arguments that the Palestinian people have put forward, the arguments that the Israeli government have put forward for its existence and the persecution of Jewish people globally. Vivek is really showing his ignorance on this issue here.
And my prism, and I think that this is going to be the foundation of a future that will lead to greater peace in the United States and I think around the world, is to be very candid that my decisions will be made through one filter. What advances the interests of the United States of America? And I don't believe that it advances the United States of America for us to assume the position of a shadow ICJ, an International Court of Justice, deciding what is or isn't proportionate from our armchair position in Washington, D.C., when we have problems of our own and threats of our own to deal with. And so my view is, again, Piers, this is part of the broken foreign policy establishment in both political parties. Once you've crossed that Rubicon, then yes, you're committed to take stances on each of these questions.
Let me ask you this.
It's not my job to adjudicate this as the U.S. president. There are the injustices in this country to most of the American people.
I mean, that's a massive departure. That would be a massive departure for any American president to say it's nothing to do with us, right?
I would say...
Exactly. It is a massive departure. In fact, even Trump, as critical as he was of the international community, understood the role of the presidency when it comes to international affairs. He openly says, even to this day, he openly says that there wouldn't be an invasion. Russia wouldn't have invaded Ukraine had he been president. So Trump fully understood the power of the presidency on international affairs. It just boggles my mind that Vivek can be this obtuse about this issue.
Trump took us a step in that direction, but this is a very different this is far further in that direction.
But Trump, if he was sitting here now, he wouldn't be saying this about...
I can't anticipate what he would say, but I can stand from my view here, even as it relates to the UN. I think that there's an open conversation to be had about whether continued involvement in the UN serves the US's or anybody else's purpose. So NATO, I think, is a different conversation from the UN. I do think that there's a conversation first, a table stakes conversation with NATO, when you have a majority of its members still not meeting its minimum 2%.
Well, they absolutely
of
should.
GDP.
And that's where Donald Trump was completely right about that.
Again,
Well, I know,
Vivek
but
is
again-
totally he's totally skirting the issues now, talking about NATO and the 2% GDP contributions that members are supposed to have. Again, a very important issue, but he's not talking about this Israel-Hamas war.
Backstop, right? So if an
American president has to have a moral compass too.
I do.
About whatever's going on anywhere in the world.
Well, I have a moral
But
compass.
particularly if they are allies
about
that
the
you
country.
are helping to fund. And right now, as you
Especially
know,
treaty-bound allies,
Right,
for
but right
example.
now there
you make
are-
a treaty that means something.
okay, but my question is this. Right now, there are thousands of children. You're a father, 2 young kids. I'm a father of 4 kids. There are thousands of young children getting killed in Gaza. Innocent Palestinian kids. Half of Gaza are kids. Women being blown to pieces. Houses and whole areas being completely decimated. 1 million Gazans have had to move from the north to the south, out of their homes, which they will not be able to return to in most cases because they've been destroyed, and they're going to be destroyed. And I get that the purpose, that Israel's stated mission purpose, is to get rid of Hamas, and I agree with them. But how they do that, the whole world is watching. And the other parts of the region, including Saudi Arabia, that are on the verge of a new accord with Israel, are now recoiling at what they see as a disproportionate response.
So I disagree with
my
some of
question
that characterization.
My question, a long-winded question, but my question is, on a human level, with the moral compass required by an American president, do you not look at what's happening now in Gaza and slightly recoil at the scale of this and what it may become in the next days, weeks, potentially months? Do you not think?
So
do you not
Piers,
think
let me address that
a responsible
directly.
American president wouldn't say to Prime Minister Netanyahu, just hang on here?
So if I may, Pearson, I appreciate you providing the backdrop for that question.
And I'm not giving you the answer.
No, I know you're not.
I'm asking you.
Yeah, and I take it as a question.
Yeah.
As a difficult question. It's a difficult answer. On that standard, we would have been engaging with most of the African continent for the better part of the last half century. We would be talking much more about what's going on in the last 3 years in Azerbaijan and Armenia. Somehow, interestingly, something you don't hear peep about in the Nagorno.
Okay, this is where I actually agree with Vivek on. Yes, you're totally right. There's the current issue, the current conflict in Azerbaijan and Armenia that is not being discussed more widely. There's the Rohingya Muslim genocide that is currently happening. There's what's going on in Yemen. There are countless conflicts that are happening around the world. And I agree with what Vivek's initial response is, but we'll keep it going.
Region. We could go on. And each of us has different capacities. I mean, you and I share multiple things in common. We're both fathers. We've both lived the full arc of what in this country, at least, we call the American dream, right? You've been successful. I have a separate hat that I wear as a philanthropist.
Okay, then he just goes on about his business ventures, etc.
Elsewhere in the world, particularly in countries which are your allies.
So I'm not.
I mean, I come from the United Kingdom, for example. If we had
I'm not saying ignore
if we
it.
had an attack like this, would you have the same philosophy to us? I mean,
It's a treaty-bound ally, right? So I think treaties mean something. And this is where I think.
But where is your moral line with what's happening in Israel right now?
Let's work backwards here from an outcome we both want to avoid: World War III.
Right.
How did World War I, the Archduke Ferdinand's death,
See, and then he goes
escalate
into the details about the history. It's
advances
like,
the American interest? And so there may be certain cases in which we do make the determination that that does advance the American interest. I'll give you one right now. Taiwan. If China were to invade Taiwan right now, I think it is the job of the U.S. to affirmatively defend. Why? Because we depend on Taiwan for semiconductors that power our modern way of life.
So you would, if you were president, you'd send troops in to defend Taiwan.
I would defend Taiwan, and I'm not going to telegraph exactly which means. There are many means to do.
you see, like, this is where I'm just so confused by Vivek because he's not substantive in his answers at all about this conflict. He keeps doubling down on this national America first, and that is so superficial, and it doesn't speak to the real suffering that's happening. And I get his point about the fact that there are many conflicts around the world, and that's a fair point. But the thing is, this conflict, in my opinion, has perhaps the biggest risk to destabilize not only the Middle East, but further polarize the world and increase hatred towards Israel and its allies throughout the world. And, the United States is in this very precarious position where I think anti-Semitism, Islamophobia will continue to rise. But I think the international community is also looking very closely at what the United States is going to do, because this blind support for Israel has to be checked with its upholding of international organizations' agreed upon values and laws. And if there are war crimes that are being committed by the Israeli government and Hamas, countries are going to look to the United States for what they are going to do in these moments.
Said that before.
I've said that before. Actually, people don't listen, but I've said that before.
You've changed your position on that.
No, I've actually been crystal clear on this at every step of the way. Now, what I've also said, where you might be getting that, is politics thing is interesting. I don't fault you for it, because that's what's in the ether. I've said that very clearly. We will defend Taiwan at least until we get semiconductor independence in the United States, at which point we will resume our current posture of strategic ambiguity.
Why would you defend Taiwan militarily but not Israel?
Well, I think that right now we depend on those little semiconductors for our modern way of life.
Just purely
and
financial.
Israel also doesn't need it.
But Israel provides a lot of stuff to America.
Well, here's my point. And this is the whole point, Piers, is it's not some top-down cookie-cutter analogizing. I analyze each situation independently.
Isn't there a core principle?
Israel is able to defend itself right now. And I think Israel will be better able to defend itself if we don't muddy the waters. Taiwan has no chance of defending itself versus China, and it matters to the U.S.
Your red line you said to me was
American interest.
It was if American citizens got attacked.
We will hit you back 10 times harder.
Okay, but American citizens were attacked.
So that's what makes this conflict difficult. Is Israel able to take care of that job? If American targets are hit as American targets, right? Let's say they know they're hitting us on an American base. That's a direct hit on the United States.
But if Americans get killed in Israel,
well, if Americans
or
get
Israel, kidnapped and taken hostage by Hamas,
we need to. Well, right now,
you don't see any.
I would prioritize getting those American hostages.
This is getting really bad.
It is a top priority.
I mean, this is bad. This is so bad. It's bad because, to me, again, it's so clear that Vivek just doesn't know what he's talking about. And I don't think that he knows precisely what his opinion is either on this. I think, surprisingly, Piers actually calls him out on his own policy positions. And Vivek is sticking to these very, again, superficial, superfluous positions when it comes to Israel and America's support for Israel. And he's completely flabbergasted at, what to do and is Israel crossing a line. It's like the moment he's confronted with Israel crossing a line, he's doubling down, well, it's none of our business. I think that's generally what Vivek's perspective is. It's none of our business. If Israel crosses the line, it's none of our business. It's like, okay, so then what about the International Criminal Court? What about the International Court of Justice? What about international organizations coming together and the UN putting forward a resolution on ceasefire? Vivek never even answered the question on ceasefire. I know he said he doesn't want to get involved, but he's also purposely skirting the issue on perhaps one of the biggest conflicts of our time right now. I think that also Vivek is very one-sided when it comes to this issue, because here was a candidate who openly criticized other candidates on the stage and in podcasts about how other candidates have to raise so much money and it's impossible to do it from individual donors, so they do it through super PACs, super political action committees. These committees can raise hundreds of millions of dollars for candidates as they continue down their path towards the presidency. And Vivek Ramaswamy, who's a billionaire, has openly criticized those candidates for having super PACs because the super PACs determine their public policy agenda to some degree, to a large degree. Well, here Vivek, while he may not have a super PAC, to my knowledge, it's clear to me that there's something else going on because he has a very strong pro-Israel stance. And if there isn't a super PAC controlling Vivek, why would he not speak from the heart of being a human being, a father, someone who can easily see through what's happening here as a clear violation of international agreed upon conventions when it comes to war crimes. The fact that he's not even upholding international law in the face of clear war crime violations makes me wonder, okay, well, you may not have a super PAC, but then why are you so against international institutions? Anyways, I found this interview so strange for Vivek and just not becoming of a presidential leader. So those are my takes on this live stream. Thanks so much for tuning in for these past 30 minutes. I wanted to actually just do a quick live stream on this interview because I just found it so obtuse coming from Vivek, someone who I think is actually someone who is thoughtful in a lot of his opinion pieces. But in this, he was just totally off the rails, and I just didn't understand it. But anyways, I hope you like this one. I will submit the recording to YouTube in a bit, so if you missed it, I will upload it there. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will catch you in the next one. Remember, this is the place. Follow me on Open Minds at Open Minds Podcast on Insta. This is the place where I accurately try to break down world issues from pure curiosity. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in the next one.